I'm here to talk about, as was mentioned, the best practices for slug management. And we're going to turn, is it on? So I want to start off with, what do slugs eat? And the answer is pretty much anything. They'll eat vegetable crops, they'll eat grain crops, they'll eat dead earthworms. They'll eat dead earthworms, they'll eat each other, they'll eat fungi. So they have pretty broad range of things that they'll feed on. A lot of times we think of them as being detritivores, things that are eating organic matter. And how do they do this? They do this with a rasping mouth part. So they have basically sandpaper for a tongue. And you can see this as a zoomed in view of that sandpaper. So based on that, they scrape away the tissue of whatever they're eating. So what does that look like when we're looking at soybeans? I have some slug damage to hand around to you so you can take a look. And what does it look like in corn? Because they're scraping, oftentimes they'll sit in one place and spend time scraping. A lot of times you'll get these irregular pits in the cotyledon. They especially seem to like the cotyledon on soybeans. Or you'll get this kind of lacy pattern because they don't make it all the way through the leaf in all of the places that they've been feeding. So you get a little bit of the leaf tissue remaining that gives you this kind of tattered tear look. And then they tend to feed between the veins, so you get more of a streaky pattern in the damage. I have got to stop hitting that button. There we go. Where it makes, again, a tattered pattern and it's going vertically. Why do we care about slug damage? If they get the cotyledon, if they get the seed early enough, they can kill the plant, whether it is corn or soybeans. So the stand loss that they cause is really the major damage. Typically the damage to the leaves is not as severe and not as problematic. So this is an example from Kentucky where you can see these are all of the seedlings that are left along this, which is less than was planted, obviously. And one of the things that we find is that soybeans are more vulnerable, and the reason in terms of they're more vulnerable to having the seedling killed. And the reason they're more vulnerable to having the seedling killed is because their growing point is at the top of the plant above the ground. So right there at the bottom of those cotyledons where the leaves are starting to come out, that's the growing point, the apical meristem, the beginning of the soybean plant. Whereas on a corn plant, until about the 7 leaf stage, the growing point is actually below the soil surface, down here at the bottom of the plant. So it's underneath the soil where the slugs can't feed. So slugs don't really dig, they're very soft. So the way they get below the soil is they get below the soil by finding cracks and crevices in the ground. So here you can see they're starting to feed actually on the plant before it even got out of the ground. And they did that because they're going they can get into the seed slot here. This crack is letting them get down there. And here again, you can see they're all down in this crack and crevice. So this is a slug, that is a slug, that is a slug. Lots of slugs down in these cracks and crevices. We have 2 common species in our area, especially on the eastern shore. I see a lot of the marsh slug, which is Deroceras laevi. And then the gray garden slug is actually the one that we know the most about, and I'll get back to that. But the gray garden slug is also very common. You can distinguish these because the gray garden slug, if you upset it, so typically what we do in my lab is we poke it with a pencil, they will produce a milky slime. So you can see the slime that they're using defensively comes out and it looks like milk. It's very cloudy. One of their alternate names is the milky slug because of this. And these are much better studied, and we think that they also may be more damaging, they feed more on plants. In general, what is a slug life cycle? Slugs are actually hermaphrodites, so they have male and female reproductive parts. And when they do typically reproduce with another individual, although they can self-fertilize. So every slug out there can produce eggs. Right. So first they typically mate, and then they lay eggs. And they'll lay eggs, they look like jelly balls. They're pretty small, 20 to 80 eggs in an egg cluster. Those eggs then hatch into smaller slugs, and they can be really small. So these are kind of the size of like perlite in soil. They're not very big. And then the first stage of the slug is the same size as the egg. So it's a very small slug that can be difficult to find. And then they grow until they're adults. The reason that we care a little bit about the different species of slug is they differ in how they overwinter. So the gray garden slug largely overwinters as eggs. And so when the eggs hatch in the spring, we kind of see a big influx of small slugs that are really hungry. And so when gray garden slug eggs hatch, and it hatches during a seedling stage, then you really see a lot of damage in that case. They rarely overwinter as adults because they need mild winters to do so, but we often see more slug damage after mild winters because the adults survived. So we have both the adults feeding and the juvenile slugs that hatched from the eggs. The marsh slug can overwinter in all life stages and seems to be pretty freeze tolerant. So you can, in the laboratory, take these, put them in a freezer, take them out of the freezer, and they're fine. So the eggs, the adults, and the juveniles will all make it through the winter. So again, slug populations tend to be higher after a mild winter. We also tend to see them in cool, wet springs because, as you know, they're very soft and mucousy. So they're really sensitive to dehydration and moisture. They're managing their moisture all of the time. They need that mucus trail to move, and they need to be able to produce mucus, so they need moisture. We tend to see them as more of a problem in wet spots in fields or in cool, wet springs when the conditions are really conducive for them to be feeding. And that's also where we tend to see them in heavy residue no-till systems because, again, that residue is holding moisture and giving them a place to shelter and avoid getting dehydrated. So in terms of slug management, we have all of the different pieces of the IPM cycle here. So of course, first we want to start with prevention and avoidance. And then we're going to get into how do you monitor and determine whether slugs are going to be a problem for you in a given year. How do you manage them culturally, chemically, and biologically? And then ultimately, what sometimes ends up happening is that you need to make replant decisions based on the damage to the stand. So starting with prevention and avoidance, as I mentioned, they're really most damaging to seedlings, and if they kill the seedling and cause stand loss. And Jenny, if you want to go ahead and hand out. So these are seedling soybeans that you can look at and see the feeding to the cotyledon, and some of them might have a little bit of feeding on the leaves. When the soybean is larger, yes, they can still cause this lacy pattern of damage, but soybeans are really resistant to defoliation, and this is really not a big deal. It's when they're killing the seedlings that we care. So if we plant earlier in the spring, when it's cooler, the seedlings take a long time to germinate, the conditions might be good for slugs, they can be vulnerable for a very long period of time. The faster the soybean seedling is growing, the quicker it gets out of that vulnerable period of being a small seedling. And so as much as we can, planting into warm soil and planting when conditions are conducive for fast growth will help avoid slug problems. And as I mentioned, they need cracks to get below the ground. So usually when we see the worst damage, we see the worst damage because the seed slot didn't close, and there's this nice, cool, moist, dry, dark area. Cool and dark area for them to hide. And they just hang out down there eating the seeds one after the other, or eating the babies, the cotyledons. So as much as you can, adjusting the closing wheels and the downforce mechanisms, making sure soil moisture is conducive for the seed slot to actually close is really important for slug management and will help avoid that worst damage where they can sit there and just feed on the plant before it even comes out of the ground. So how do you monitor and assess risk for slugs? First, and why do you want to monitor for slugs? First, you want to confirm that slugs are a problem, and I'll get into what else looks like slug damage and why I'm handing out slug damage for you to really look at. And then you use slug monitoring to localize hotspots to prioritize management. So maybe you have a really sluggy field. Perhaps you plant a different field first and come back when weather's a little bit warmer in that field. And then we don't have any treatment thresholds currently for managing slugs. And I just want to show you here, this is a shelter trap, which I'll get into how you make those in a minute. And underneath it, you can see some slugs. So this is one of the ways that we can monitor for slugs. Is it slugs? The best indicator, but you don't always see this, is whether or not there's a silvery slime. So you can often see the silvery slime that they leave behind as they're moving, left behind as a residue on the plant leaf. Then for sure you know that a slug came by. But of course, you're going to see this on your crop after you've already planted and after you're already seeing the seedling damage that I'm handing around. So you might be interested in knowing before you plant whether you have slugs or not. The other pest that can look quite similar to slugs and is managed completely different is seed corn maggot. So seed corn maggot is a fly larva. It's this little white thing about the size of a grain of rice. And they use their whole body to tunnel into the cotyledon. So usually you'll see actually more linear feeding. It can, because it's also cool and wet, typically when we have this problem, it can look kind of slimy, but it doesn't have the silvery sheen. And that is actually more because the plant material is rotting. And again, as I mentioned, slugs really tend to make pits. They make holes because they sit in one place and rasp and rasp and rasp. And you can also, of course, look for the slugs themselves or the fly larvae themselves. And then the flies pupate, so you might see these brown pupae from the seed corn maggot. Slugs are active at night, so that's one of the reasons it can be hard to actually find the slugs. You typically find the damage, not the slugs. And in the daytime, they're sheltering under cracks, under residue, places where there's some moisture so that they can stay out of the hot sun. So you have to go out at night and look for them if you want to see them up feeding on the plant in a lot of cases. I've seen them up feeding on the plant in the daytime if it's overcast and a little bit drizzly. That can be good enough for them. But typically you're going to see them at nighttime, not in the day. So if you want to visually scout them, you have to look under residue. They really like corn stalk and corn tiller roots because there's lots of cracks and crevices in the soil around them. So here you can see they actually laid an egg mass right there in between the roots of the old corn stubble. So that's a good place to look. And you want to look for the eggs for the juveniles and the adults if you're going to be visually looking to see if you have slugs in your field. The other way that you can do this is you give them an artificial shelter so that they'll hide under the shelter and you have a specific place to look. And so the way we do this is we take roofing shingle, and you want a gray one so that it doesn't heat up too much. So gray or white is the best color. And just cut a 1 foot by 1 foot piece of it out, throw it in the field flat on the ground with good soil contact. And then you go back and you flip it over and you look underneath where you had it and also on the shingle itself. So this is an example of monitoring that we've been doing. So we were funded by the United Soybean Board. It's actually a national project with many states involved. But I'm just showing Virginia and Maryland because we had the sluggiest year last year. So these are some of the samples that we were taking. And these were our particularly sluggy fields where we saw damage. So this is the number of slugs that we caught every week from March to July in Virginia and in Maryland at our sluggiest sites. And one of the things, and also where the star is where it was actually planted. So we started sampling before planting, and then we kept sampling through the seedling stage and into the season. So one of the things you might notice is that some of these sluggy fields started out with not so many slugs before planting, and then all of a sudden all the slugs came in. Some of them started off with lots of slugs, and then the slugs actually declined after planting. So the trapping or the monitoring for the slug, this is why we don't have thresholds before planting, doesn't necessarily capture the whole picture of whether or not you're going to have slug problems. But it does tell you for sure they're there. And if you have a lot of them, then it may tell you for sure you should do management. But we don't have anything that is more specific than that at this time to recommend. And we're continuing to monitor in lots of places in hopes that we can be able to tell you with more certainty what is really a slug problem. And you can also see in Maryland, we never caught more than 15 slugs per week, whereas in Virginia, they were catching 70 slugs per week. So it could be worse. So how do you manage slugs? We start with the cultural options, so some things that you can do to reduce the chances of slug damage. Reducing the residue near the seedling has two functions. One, it keeps the habitat where they're happy away from your seedling. And two, it helps the soil warm up right by the seedling. And again, the seedling is growing fast, so then it's gonna help hopefully outgrow the damage before the slug kills the seedling. So anything that you can do with row cleaners, turbo or vertical tillage if that fits in your program, and also avoiding solid manure that's gonna add some more cover to the field. Anything you can do to reduce residue helps. And it just needs to be, again, right there by where the soybean seeds are. So you can see with a row cleaner, it just pushed it off to the side a little bit, so you have this nice area where the seedlings can germinate well. And again, anything you can do to encourage quick growth, anything you can do to outrun the slugs. So choosing hybrids or varieties that have excellent emergence and vigor ratings in the early season so that you get that seedling up and growing is the best way to go. Adding a starter fertilizer, pop it up as fast as you can. In terms of chemical management, we have lots of grain insect pest management options, things that we can do to manage insect pests. So we have the BT plant incorporated hybrids that control caterpillars and some beetles. We have the neonicotinoid insecticide seed treatments that are going to control grubs and wireworms and also travel through the plant and control some above ground caterpillars and feeders. And then we can also potentially use in furrow at planting pyrethroid insecticides that also are covering insects. None of these products are going to manage slugs. And the reason I bring this up is because they will manage seed corn maggot, which is an insect. They will not manage slugs. This is why you need to make sure, do you have slugs? Do you have seed corn maggot? It makes a big difference to how you're managing. And we'll circle back to some of these might actually be harming your ability to manage slugs. The only effective chemical control product is slug baits. If the metaldehyde-based ones like Deadline are a little bit more toxic, so if you're worried about domestic animals, dogs getting into the bait, these ones are a little bit more toxic to mammals than the iron phosphate-based baits. And the way the baits work is that the slug has to eat them, and then ideally there's dry weather because it's poisoned, and if it has dry weather as that additional stress, they die faster. So you really want the slug bait out there, but you don't want to put it out right before rain. Because you want them to eat it and then basically be stressed out. And so spreading baits is really the only option for chemical controls. What are typical rates that we see? We don't recommend anything less than 5 pounds per acre. Really, and the max label rate is 10 pounds per acre, and really that's better. These baits tend to be expensive, so people want to know how to make that less expensive for managing slugs. One way to do that is to reduce the rate down to 5 pounds per acre, but only band it over the row. So then you're really right there protecting your plant instead of broadcasting it. And many of you may not have the hopper boxes to do this anymore. But if you can, banding it over the row is the best option. If you have to broadcast it, hitting the hot spots. So again, doing that monitoring and figuring out where you have the hot spots rather than treating the whole field is another way to reduce the costs of slug bait. As I mentioned, dry weather after application improves slug kill. This is a bait trial that David Owens from University of Delaware was doing, and you can see that it was quite wet. So the bait is starting to dissolve and also floating in that wet cover. So that's not going to improve. That's going to be a problem for the bait's efficacy, especially if it's dissolving, because they have to come and eat those baits. Weathering in the formulation of which product you buy can impact the efficacy. Historically, these have had a lot of problems with dissolving really fast in rain, but a lot of the formulations have improved in the last 10 years, and they are better under rainy conditions than they used to be. If you want to do contact treatments, there are some that are coming down the pipeline in terms of they may be registered in the future that we're starting to test. What we found is the conditions must be perfect, because instead of them coming and eating it, it has to touch them. So they have to be active, they have to be up on the plant, they have to hit that spray has to hit them for it to work. So you have to have a little light drizzle in the early evening while they're actually up on the plant for this to work. Perfect conditions don't happen that often, so we're not finding that to be too promising. And some of you might have heard that there's a urea home remedy, so you're using nitrogen to just burn them. Again, it's kind of like a salt. The same way that would work is by contact. So the conditions have to be absolutely perfect for the home remedy to work. So it has to be in the early evening to at nighttime while the slugs are up on the plant. You would use a 30% urea-based nitrogen solution with 10 grams. You want 10 gallons of the nitrogen solution to 10 gallons of water, 20 gallons per acre, and it has to fit in your nutrient management plan.
Good point.
So, this home remedy, the slugs have to be up on the plants. It's a pretty high rate of nitrogen, so you can burn the leaves. And it's also, in years where nitrogen isn't so cheap, it can be expensive as well. So it's really hard to make this work, and I do not recommend it as the solution. If you're going to do a chemical control strategy, use a slug bait. What do we have in terms of biological control options? We have Dr. Mike Crosley at the University of Delaware. He's studying nematodes. And so they're actually nematodes or little worms that are parasitizing slugs and killing slugs. So here's what a nematode looks like underneath a microscope. Here's what an infected slug looks like before it dies. It's pretty gross. They're living inside it, they reproduce inside it, and they produce all of these infective juveniles that go off and find new slugs. There are some nematode formulations that are registered and applied in Europe, but we don't have any commercially available here yet. And he's working with others in the United States to try to find out if we have nematodes we could use and if we can get someone to formulate a product. So this is pretty far down the pipeline, but a potential option in the future. Lots of animals eat slugs. So here's a snake eating a slug. This here is a carabid beetle, and as you can see, eating a slug is not the easiest thing. They're thick, they're mucousy, there are very few, it's a little bit difficult to eat a slug. So it does take them some time to kill one. But carabid ground beetles are really what we think of as our best slug predator, as something that could be out there helping us control slugs. The problem with carabid ground beetles is they're insects. So those broad spectrum insecticides that I mentioned, the in-furrow pyrethroids, the neonicotinoid seed treatments that we're applying at the beginning of the season when we might be having slug problems, can also harm these beetles that are killing slugs. So in Pennsylvania and in Virginia, they've done experiments to look at pre-planting insecticides, and that's the only thing that correlated. That was the only thing that predicted whether you were going to have slug damage, is you are more likely to have slug damage in fields where you were using pre-planting insecticides or at planting insecticides. So my PhD student, Dr. Marina Kramer, was doing an experiment. She did this for over 3 years at Keedysville, the Y, and Beltsville. So we covered all of Maryland, and we were comparing completely untreated bare seed in field corn with poncho at a 250 rate, as well as capture in furrow at 13.6 fluid ounces per acre. And we measured many things in this study, whether it was controlling insects, what its impact on yield was, but we also were interested in how does this impact the predators that might be active in your field. So how do you figure out whether there's predators eating things in your field? We put out these little wax moth larvae. These are actually a pest of honeybees. They're extremely delicate and easy to kill. It turns out you can't restrain a slug. They're slimy, they don't like it, it's impossible to keep them still. But you can tape a caterpillar to a card. So we would tape a caterpillar to a card with enough space so that it could still wiggle and look like a live prey item, and put them out in the field overnight to see what was active at night that could be feeding on slugs. And then we would come back. These are all healthy, happy larvae that just got to spend the night in the field. Here's 60% mortality, so this one's been chewed up, this one's been chewed up, this one's been totally taken away and eaten, it's gone. And all that's left is some of the blood. So this is how we evaluated whether predators were active or not. What did we find? What was the impact on the bottom line of whether predators were killing pests in the field? We didn't find any significant differences between this, and we did find some of those beetles out there eating these Galeria, these larvae. But we didn't find that the seed treatments were impacting predation at this general level across all of the field sites and all of the years. We also captured the predators to see how many were out there and active and whether that was different between these different treatments. So how we did that is we put out, basically you put out a pit trap so that they run and then they fall down the sides and they fall into a cup, and you put a little lid over it so that it doesn't fill up with rain. So we captured those in the early season to see what was out there and how that varied between these different treatments. So rove beetles are particularly good predators. We didn't see any impacts on the rove beetles, and this is the number of these organisms we caught per week on the y-axis. Centipedes are also good predators. We didn't see any differences in the centipedes, but the beetle larvae, so the larval form of those crabid beetles, the ground beetles that feed on slugs, we did see a difference where untreated fields had more of those than the treated fields. And this is actually a catch-all because it's really hard to separate the larvae of different species. So this was not only crabid beetles, it was also some soldier beetles and some other beetles that have beetle larvae that are all similar, but we saw an impact on beetle larvae. We also saw a bit of an impact on spiders, and it seemed like the neonicotinoid seed treatments were a little worse on spiders than the pyrethroid in terms of their activity. And there are spiders that feed on slugs as well. Looking specifically at the carabids, there are actually a lot of carabids out there that actually eat weed seeds. They're another good biological control for controlling plant weeds. They're typically very small. So we separated the small carabid beetles, and actually we identified the Malta species, but I didn't think you cared. And we put the large species that might be able to feed on a slug in a separate category. But it didn't matter how we categorized them. We did not see an impact on the total abundance that we were capturing of either kind of ground beetle. So we didn't see these treatments having an effect on the adults. Were these beetles slug predators? Calenius tricolor is the ground beetle that is for sure a slug predator. It's a specialist on slugs and snails. And it's the second most common ground beetle that we caught. We caught 373 of those. We also found them in 17 of the 18 fields across the 3-year study that we looked in. So these predators are pretty common out there in the field. We also wanted to know, okay, what if we had these impacts on these predatory organisms? Would that impact how much slug damage we got or how many slugs that we saw? And we didn't see a difference in the number of slugs either, although you can tell that we did occasionally find quite a lot of slugs. So this is the number of slugs per plot. And again, we didn't see that those insecticides impacted that either. So although we didn't see too many direct impacts on the adult beetles, they're very mobile, and so they could be coming in from field edges and other places. The larval beetles are less mobile, and they are the next generation of adults for the next year. So the fact that we saw some impacts on those is a little bit concerning. So as much as possible, it would be good to preserve the existing natural enemies, because as I mentioned, slug baits are really our only other option for controlling slugs. So finally, we get to, if you had stand loss, what are you going to do about it? And this is what I have, one of the things about slugs that I think also is a little bit understudied. So across Maria's study, when we looked, this is the yield in bushels per acre on the y-axis, and this is the number of plants that were, the percent of the plants that were damaged by slugs on the x-axis across the 3 farms and the 3 years in different colors. If slugs were really impacting yield, and this is, again, we weren't seeing stand loss at this stage. If slugs were really impacting yield, you would expect to see a pretty strong downward line, whereas the more plants that were damaged, the lower the yield. But we didn't really see that line in any of these farms across these years. Sometimes we had fields that had really good yield with nothing, and sometimes we had fields with really good yield, with really low yields with no plants damaged. You know, yield varies. But sometimes we had pretty high damaged plants. At Keedysville, we got up to 80%, and we couldn't really see a difference in the yields. So we didn't see any impact of slug damage on corn yield, and that was also reflected in looking at the plants. So the early season, you looked at some of these plants and wow, that looks really bad. The seedling is missing a lot of its leaf area, but it's putting out a new leaf, and it ended up growing fine and yielding pretty well. So when you're not impacting stand, the impact of slugs may not be quite economic. So when you are impacting stand, and again, you have to go out and look at what your stand counts are. So this was from last year in soybeans, and you can see that there's not so many plants, and those plants are lacy and slug damaged. Oftentimes this damage is patchy, so you end up with holes in the field rather than the whole field has a stand problem. And it can be a complicated decision in that situation whether you should be replanting or not. And it's a complicated decision that involves economics and is not related to insects. So I recommend you look at some of these really nice replanting economic consideration articles from The Economist that tell you, is it worth replanting or not? That's a decision that you're gonna have to make. I know typically what I hear from farmers is the way they manage slugs is they fill in the holes, but they replant the field. And I've heard of fields being replanted 3 times, which I don't know whether that's economic or not. That's for the economists to decide. Because they keep planting and having slug damage. So that's one of the last things that you can do to try to mitigate slug damage is to replant and hope that the conditions for slugs have changed. So in summary, what are the things that we need to do to effectively reduce slug problems? We have the highest risk when we have mild winters followed by cool, wet springs. And so 2024, we saw a lot of slugs. We barely had a winter before that, and then we had a cool, wet spring. It was the perfect year for slugs. You really want to have good seed to soil contact. You can't have those open seed slots. You want the plants to germinate quickly. So if it's possible, plant later when the soil is warmer. Make sure that the seed slot is closing. Reduce residue near the seedling, push it away with those trash wheels. And then also consider, okay, I have damage, but is it really economic? Is the plant going to grow out of it? And soybeans also, as long as the growing tip is not killed, soybeans are very good at compensating for defoliation, for loss of leaves. So the question is the damage impacting the stand? And how much is it impacting the stand? Because also in soybeans, they kind of get bushier and fill in. So a lot of times, even with lower stands, you're still going to get a pretty good yield. Is the weather warming? Are we moving out of slug conditions, or is the weather staying cool and wet? These can all impact whether and how you should be managing slugs. Slug bait is the only effective option. Most people that I know that are doing it on the commercial scale are going to mix it in with a fertilizer and spread it with a spreader. And so this is what those little bait granules look like. It's possible you can skip the seed and in-furrow insecticides where insect pests are not a problem. So here's just a picture of one of the wolf spiders eating one of those larvae. Again, as much as we can preserve the natural enemies, the things that are out there helping us control slugs as well. No-till fields have, and the residue that they have actually is really good for natural enemies. So we actually have a lot of predators, as I mentioned. Most of the fields had this beetle that eats slugs in them, which is not always the case. So we do have a lot of natural predators out there helping us. And then if you are using at-planting insecticides, just remember, you have to have economic pest pressure for those to translate to yield. I've been working on this issue since I started. In 1 year did I get economic pest pressure. I went and found a wireworm field at Beltsville, and Capture and Cruiser, both alone, you don't need to combine them, both were able to increase yield because they reduced wireworm damage. But only in that year have I ever seen significant enough grub or wireworm pressure for those treatments to be economic. If you want to participate in 2025, as I mentioned, we've been funded by the United Soybean Board. David Owens and Mike Crosley, because they're in Delaware, are handling the Eastern Shore side of the experiment. So if you want someone to evaluate slug bait and tillage on your farms, or possibly trap slugs, David Owens is a great person to reach out to. And Mike Crosley is collecting slugs to try to find these beneficial nematodes, so he's also looking for sluggy fields on the Eastern Shore. I also want to mention a resource that I'm not sure people are familiar with. But the Southern IPM Center in Clemson, and associated with a lot of us, David Owens and I wrote the slug section of this, have developed my IPM app for grain crops. So it has corn and soybeans, as well as peanut and a few other things in it. And you can download it to your phone and just download the pieces that you want. And then it's available to you even without internet in the field. And edits are ongoing, so they're pushed out to the device and it gets updated as we update those recommendations. And it has labeled pesticides and the rates that you want to use, photos of the pests and other management information, and all the row crops are in the same place. So I'd like to acknowledge all of my lab members, funding sources, and of course the Research and Education Center staff. Without their help, this would not be possible. And if you want more information, my lab did write a slug fact sheet. So it's available online, and I've left you the QR code. I have a few copies if you want one. You can always contact me, and my lab website also has a lot of our information. So I'll take any questions, and I think I have a little bit of time and kept us on time.
Questions? Oh, come on, no questions on slugs?
I have one.
Okay.
So are there any threshold levels for either counts or plant damage to determine if you need to treat or should treat?
The question was, are there any thresholds for either counts of slugs or plant damage for when you need to treat or retreat? And the answer is no. We have not really figured that out. That's one of the things that we're trying to do with this United Soybean Board grant. Pennsylvania has a number that has a kind of a rule of thumb that they recommend that I think is much too low for our area. And one of those issues is because we have a mixture of slug species, I think it matters. They have mostly gray garden slugs, which tend to be more damaging, but we see a lot of marsh slugs, and I don't think they're as bad. So at this point, no, but we're working on it.